Chapter 9, From Seed to Cup. Every cup of coffee anyone has ever drunk represents the end of a demanding physical journey. It starts with a small white flower on a tropical tree. It ends, months and dozens of processing steps later, as a roasted, ground substance that barely resembles where it began. Most people who drink coffee every morning have never given a moment's thought to everything that had to happen before that first sip was even possible. This chapter is about that journey. A tree that flowers and fruits at the same time. The coffee tree has one genuinely strange habit worth understanding first. It doesn't follow a single, orderly flowering season followed by a single fruiting season, the way most fruit trees do. Instead, ripe fruit, unripe green fruit, open flowers, and flower buds can all grow on the very same branch at the same time. They're arranged in careful order along its length, not mixed together at random. A single coffee tree is always somewhere in the middle of its reproductive cycle. Never fully finished. Never fully starting over. The flowers themselves are small, white, and tubular. After they wither and drop away, small red fruits emerge in their place. Most people call them coffee berries. Botanically, that's the wrong word. True berries are structured like grapes. Coffee fruits are structured more like cherries or peaches. Technically, they're drupes, fleshy fruits built around a hard, stone-like center. It takes roughly 6 to 7 months for these drupes to fully ripen into the small, ellipsoidal red fruits that pickers eventually harvest. Inside each ripe coffee cherry sit 2 seed compartments. Each contains a single seed wrapped in its own thin, parchment-like covering. These 2 seeds sit face to face, their flat sides touching. They become the 2 coffee beans most people picture when they think of coffee. Occasionally, a cherry develops with only a single rounder seed instead of 2. This variant has earned its own name in the trade, the peaberry. Some drinkers prize it as a distinct, sought-after style of bean. A single Arabica coffee tree can produce anywhere from 1 to 12 pounds of usable coffee in a year. The real figure varies enormously depending on the tree, the region, and the growing conditions. Some poorly suited regions produce less than 200 pounds of coffee per acre in an entire year. On the other extreme, one especially well-documented patch of trees in Brazil yielded roughly 17 pounds of coffee per individual tree. Multiply that across an acre of similarly productive trees, and you get a wildly different scale of harvest entirely. Planting a tree that takes years to pay off. Coffee seeds don't stay viable for long. If they're thoroughly dried or simply left sitting too long, they lose the ability to germinate within 3 or 4 months. Unlike grain crops, which can be stockpiled and planted whenever convenient, coffee seed has to be planted quickly or wasted entirely. Once planted, it takes roughly 6 weeks for a seed to germinate and push up through the soil. From there, patience becomes the defining feature of the whole enterprise. A tree grown from seed typically doesn't produce its first blossoms for about 3 years. Even then, a genuinely good, commercially worthwhile harvest usually isn't possible until the tree is 5 or 6 years old. Once mature, an Arabica tree generally stays productive for around 30 years before its usefulness as a crop-bearing plant ends. Growers don't always rely on seeds. Coffee can also grow from cuttings, upright branches that, once they take root on their own, go on to produce their own seed-bearing lateral branches. This method spares growers the considerable expense of producing seed in bulk. It also allows deliberate hybridization between different varieties. Dutch researchers pursued this with real scientific rigor at an experimental garden in Bangilan, Java, established in 1900. They eventually catalogued a dozen distinct recognized varieties of Coffea arabica alone. One delightful, almost absurd detail survives from Central America. Farmers there occasionally used young coffee uprights as literal fence posts. Coffee wood turns out to be genuinely strong. Dense enough for cabinet making. It can withstand a crushing force of nearly 6,000 pounds per square inch. But a coffee fence post has one drawback a post cut from dead lumber doesn't have. It's still alive. Old accounts of Central American coffee farms describe walking along a property line and seeing the fence posts themselves quietly sprouting new growth. An entire boundary fence slowly turning, post by post, back into a living row of coffee trees. An unexpected rival for the harvest. Human pickers aren't always the first to reach a ripening coffee cherry. In parts of India and Africa, birds and monkeys have their own long-standing appetite for ripe coffee fruit. In India, this gave rise to a peculiar, genuinely existing category of coffee known in the trade as monkey coffee. These are beans that passed whole through the digestive tract of a monkey that ate the ripe cherries, later collected undigested from the ground. It's an early, entirely unglamorous ancestor of the various, animal-processed specialty coffees that would eventually develop a cult following among coffee enthusiasts many generations later. Long after this book's original sources were written. As for the fleshy pulp surrounding the beans, it has never found much of a commercial market among humans. Various attempts over the years to turn it into an edible food product never gained real popularity. For the most part, birds have simply held an uncontested monopoly over eating it. From a processing standpoint, that pulp is really more of an obstacle than an asset. Something that has to be removed before the valuable beans hidden inside can be extracted and prepared. 2 paths to a clean bean. Coffee-growing regions have used 2 fundamentally different ways to strip a coffee cherry down to its beans, since the very earliest days of cultivation. The older method is called the dry method. Here, the entire harvested fruit is simply left to dry out completely, cherry and all, before workers crack it open to release the beans inside. An 18th-century French traveler's account of coffee cultivation in Yemen describes this ancient process in detail. Berries were left to dry directly on the tree until their outer covering began to shrivel. At that point, workers would shake the trees, letting the fully matured fruit drop onto cloths spread out beneath them to catch it. The gathered cherries were then spread out to dry further in direct sunlight on mats. Workers husked them using simple wooden or stone rollers, dried them again and finally separated them from their husks using large hand fans. A winnowing process that relied entirely on wind and manual effort. The second approach, the wet method, takes a more mechanically involved path. Rather than drying the whole cherry, machinery removes the fleshy pulp shortly after harvest. This leaves behind 2 slippery, glistening seed packets that, at this stage, look almost nothing like the coffee beans they'll eventually become. Workers set these wet seed packets aside to dry under carefully controlled conditions that deliberately allow fermentation to take hold. This fermentation step does some fairly sophisticated chemical work. First comes a yeast-driven fermentation that produces alcohol. Then a bacterial fermentation that generates lactic acid. Lactic acid is the primary force actually responsible for loosening the tough, glutinous parchment layer still clinging to each seed. For the very finest coffee, growers often allow an additional acetic acid fermentation to take place. It subtly alters the bean's eventual color, provided the surrounding temperature stays above a fairly specific threshold throughout the process. Once fermentation finishes its job, the parchment covering cracks open easily and comes away. It takes with it a thin, delicate silver-colored membrane sitting just beneath it. Fragments of this membrane can often still be found lingering in the natural groove running down the center of a finished coffee bean. A small structural leftover from a fruit that once looked nothing like what ends up in your morning grinder. Building the machines that sped it all up. For roughly the first 2 centuries of organized coffee cultivation, processing methods stayed close to the simple, labor-intensive Arab techniques first described by early travelers to Yemen. The Dutch and French colonial planters who followed largely stuck with only modest variations on those same basic methods for a long time afterward. That began changing seriously in the second half of the 18th century. Expanding cultivation across new colonies created real pressure to handle ever larger harvests more efficiently. William Panter received the first English patent for a coffee husking mill in 1775. Right around the time Brazil was beginning to take coffee cultivation seriously as an industry. From there, the inventions came steadily. A coffee drying patent in England in 1806, credited to an idea originally passed along by an unnamed foreign inventor. The first American coffee huller patent, granted to Nathan Reed of Belfast, Maine in 1822. Further American huller patents in 1825 and 1829. An 1834 English patent for a huller built around circular wooden discs fitted with wire teeth. Improved hullers out of Boston in 1835. And in 1845, a self-contained machine out of Kingston, Jamaica, capable of pulping, dressing, and sorting coffee all in a single mechanical process. Scotland got in on the business too. William Mackinnon began manufacturing dedicated coffee plantation machinery at his Spring Garden Iron Works in Aberdeen starting in 1840. The company, remarkably, kept operating under his name for decades after his death in 1873. Around 1850, English inventor John Walker introduced a cylinder pulpier specifically designed for Arabian variety coffee. He built it with a copper pulping surface punched through with a distinctive half-moon pattern that raised the cut edges into small raised half circles. This design became especially popular among planters in Ceylon and India. By the time all of these individual innovations had accumulated across roughly a century of steady tinkering, the entire process had transformed. Turning a freshly picked coffee cherry into a clean, dried, hulled, polished, and properly sorted green coffee bean ready for export had gone from a slow, almost entirely manual craft into a substantially mechanized industrial operation. One capable of handling harvests measured in the millions of pounds, rather than the small mat-dried batches described in that 18th century account of old Yemen. What actually happens between the tree and your cup? Step back and look at everything this chapter has covered. The sheer number of stages involved in getting from a flowering coffee tree to a finished, gradeable green bean is genuinely striking. Pollination. Months of ripening alongside flowers and buds still forming on the very same branch. Careful picking, time to catch the cherries at exactly the right moment. Pulp removal by one of two entirely different methods. A deliberate, carefully managed fermentation process involving at least 2 and sometimes 3 distinct microbial reactions. Drying. Hulling. The removal of a delicate silver skin. Polishing. And finally, sorting and grading by size and quality. All of this happens before a single bean has even been roasted. It's worth sitting with that the next time you're waiting on a cup of coffee to brew. Every single bean in that cup went through this entire sequence. Whether it was processed on a mat spread out under the Yemeni sun 3 centuries ago, or run through a modern mechanized pulping line on a plantation the size of a small town. The bean you're about to drink has already had a longer, more complicated journey than almost any other ingredient in your kitchen. What's coming next? And yet, everything covered in this chapter still produces nothing you'd actually recognize as coffee. A dried, hulled, green coffee bean is pale, hard, grassy smelling. About as far from the rich, dark, aromatic substance in your morning cup as a raw potato is from a plate of crispy fries. The transformation that finally turns this green bean into something recognizable, the transformation that produces coffee's familiar color, aroma, and flavor, doesn't happen in the field at all. It happens afterward, over intense heat, in a process with its own long and surprisingly intricate history. In the next chapter we step into the roasting room. We'll look at exactly what fire does to a coffee bean, and how humanity slowly figured out how to control that transformation with real precision.